Picture a section of stone wall on the western edge of a great city. On the night of May the 28th, in the year 1453, the wall is the most famous defensive structure in the medieval world. The land walls of Constantinople. On those battlements, somewhere along the 4 miles of fortification that face inland from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn, men with torches and bows and tired eyes have been watching the water for hours. They have been watching for ships, not ships that were specifically promised to arrive on this specific night. Ships that Rome had called for in letters sent to courts across Europe. Ships that the Senate of Venice had debated in its chambers 1,000 miles away. Ships that the city behind those walls had spent the last desperate winters of the empire telling itself would come. The horizon was empty. By the next morning, the city would be lost. The greatest Christian city in the East. The seat of an empire whose political lineage ran through the entire Roman tradition, would fall to the armies of a 21-year-old sultan. Many of the men on the walls that night would not survive to see the following sunset. What we know, looking back, is that the sea was silent, that the silence had lasted too long, and that whatever rescue had been promised was not arriving in time to matter. We remember crusaders who marched 1,000 miles to free Jerusalem from Muslim hands. We tell their stories in books and films and Sunday sermons. So here is a question that does not get asked nearly enough. When the greatest Christian city in the world was dying, when the Second Rome was burning, when its emperor was begging Europe for help in letters that read like the final words of a drowning man, where was everyone? Why did no crusade arrive? Why did no rescue come in time? The answer is not Mehmed II. The answer is not the cannons. The answer lies in a dinner held in Florence 14 years before the siege, in a Senate chamber in Venice in the cold weeks of February, on a battlefield in Hungary 9 years earlier, in 100 small decisions made by men who never set foot in Constantinople and never had to watch it die. This is the story of how an empire ends, not in a single night of fire, in a long, slow chain of people choosing, again and again, that saving you was not worth the cost. The city behind the walls was not what it had once been. Anyone who knew the old chronicles understood this. Constantinople in its greatness had held something like 400,000 souls. By the spring of 1453, fewer than 50,000 people lived inside its walls. Whole districts stood empty. Mulberry trees grew through the floors of abandoned mansions. Goats grazed in courtyards where senators had once gathered. The city was a body that had been losing blood for centuries, and the wound had never properly closed. The walls themselves carried a legend that the city desperately wanted to be true. For 1,000 years, the great Theodosian land walls on the western side of the city had turned away every army that tried them. That was the version everyone repeated. The fuller truth was more complicated. In 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, the city had fallen. Not through the famous land walls, but through the sea walls along the Golden Horn, breached by Venetian ships. The walls had a reputation, but the reputation already had cracks in it, and the cracks were 249 years old. Behind those walls in 1453, there were not enough men to defend the perimeter. Emperor Constantine XI knew this. What he did not know, what no one knew with precision, was exactly how bad the number was. So he gave a quiet order. He called for his chief minister and longtime friend, a man named George Francis, and told him to take a private count. Walk the parishes, speak to the priests, find out, house by house, how many men in this city could carry a weapon. Tell no one the answer. Francis did the work. He came back with a number. 4,773 Greek men capable of fighting, with perhaps 2,000 foreign soldiers and sailors, mostly Italian, who had come to help. Less than 8,000 defenders in total, spread across walls that ran for over 12 miles around the city. The Theodosian land walls alone, the most important section, stretched roughly 4 miles. That meant a single man every few yards, awake all night. Every night, for as long as the siege would last. When Francis brought the number to Constantine, the emperor read it and gave a strict instruction. Tell no one. If the citizens learn how few we are, they will lose hope before the first arrow is fired. We will lose the city to despair before we lose it to the Turk. That single moment captures something about Constantinople in 1453 that most accounts skip. This was not a great fortress preparing for a famous last stand. This was a city that knew it could not save itself. A city whose survival depended entirely on someone else arriving. A city that, every morning for 2 years, had looked out at the sea and asked the same question. Are they coming today? Are they coming tomorrow? Will they come in time? The promises had been made. That was the thing that kept the people standing on the walls. The Pope had called for a crusade. Letters had been sent to every Christian king in Europe. The Republic of Venice had held meetings and voted on resolutions. The Republic of Genoa had its own interests and its own quiet assurances. Hungary, the great Christian shield on the Danube, had a famous warlord and a battered army. Somewhere out there, in the courts and chambers and marble halls of Latin Christendom, men were debating the rescue of Constantinople. The people inside the walls believed it. They had to. The alternative was unthinkable. But here is the brutal arithmetic of a city living on someone else's promise. Every week that passed without ships was a week closer to the moment when no ships could arrive in time. Constantine understood this. He had already made his calculation. Mehmed had offered him terms before the siege began. Surrender the city. Keep your life. Take a province in the Peloponnese and rule there as a vassal. Save the people from the sack that follows a refused city. Constantine refused. We tend to romanticize that refusal. We talk about honor and Christian dignity and the Second Rome. Those readings are not wrong, but they are incomplete. There was a colder calculation in Constantine's mind. If he surrendered now, the city was lost forever. If he held the walls, even for a few weeks, there was still time. Time for the Venetian fleet to round the Peloponnese. Time for the Pope's letters to bear fruit. Time for someone, somewhere, to remember that the Second Rome was burning and that tens of thousands of Christians were trapped inside it. He was holding the city open like a wound, hoping the world would arrive before the wound killed him. The man who walked into Florence in the spring of 1439 was an emperor. But he did not look like one. He was tired. He was sick. He had been at sea for months. His brother had died on the journey south. He had left his own dying empire behind him to come here, to a city of bankers and painters and clever men, to do something that no Eastern Roman emperor had done in nearly 400 years. He had come to bend the knee to Rome. His name was John VIII Palaiologos. He was the older brother of the Constantine who would die on the walls 14 years later, and he had come to Italy to do the most difficult thing his office had ever required of any of its holders. He had come to put the Orthodox Church on the bargaining table, not in the sense that he owned it. He did not. Not in the sense that he had the spiritual authority to give it away. He did not have that either. But in the brutal political sense, he was the only man left who could attempt the bargain at all. He was offering the religious unity of the East to the Latin West, in exchange for the only thing that could save his empire, an army. The Christian world had been split in two for almost 400 years. The Great Schism of 1054 had separated the Greek Orthodox East from the Latin Catholic West, and over the centuries that split had hardened from a theological disagreement into something close to mutual loathing. The two churches argued about whether the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father alone or from the Father and the Son. They argued about whether the Pope had authority over all Christians or only over the Latin West. They argued about the bread used in communion, about whether priests could marry, about the words of the creed. To outsiders, these arguments could sound like a quarrel between brothers about which fork to use at dinner. To the people inside them, they were not small. They were the difference between true Christianity and heresy. And the wound between East and West had been made far deeper. 235 years before John walked into Florence, by an event that Eastern Christians had never forgotten and never forgiven. The Fourth Crusade of 1204, a Latin Crusader army. transported by ships that the Republic of Venice had built and paid for, had been diverted from its march toward the Holy Land. Instead of fighting Muslims, the Crusaders had turned on one of the largest Christian cities in the world. They had besieged Constantinople. They had broken through. And then for 3 days they had done to a Christian capital what Christian armies were supposed to do only to the enemies of Christ. They had sacked the city. They had looted the churches. They had stripped the altars of Hagia Sophia. They had set up a Latin empire on the throne of the Caesars and held the city for nearly 6 decades. The Byzantines took the city back in 1261. They rebuilt what they could, but there is a saying among historians that captures what happened. The empire that came back was not the empire that had been lost. The population had collapsed. Many of the empire's richest territories had been lost or were slipping beyond recovery. The treasury was empty. The army was a shadow of its former self. 1453 was the day Constantinople died to the world. 1204 was the day it began bleeding in a way that never quite stopped. So you can understand the room that John VIII walked into in Florence. He was not negotiating with strangers. He was negotiating with the spiritual heirs of the men who had sacked his capital. He was sitting across the table from cardinals whose city had grown wealthier on the relics looted from his ancestors' churches. He needed their armies. He could not get those armies without their church. He could not get their church without doing what no Orthodox emperor had ever done. He had to admit that the Pope was right. He did it. After months of theological debate, after late dinners in Florentine palaces, after pressure from his own delegation and from the Latins across the table, John VIII Palaiologos signed the union of the two churches. On paper. The schism of 1054 was over. On paper. The Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church were one body again. On paper. The Christian West now had a sacred reason and a moral obligation to defend the Christian East. He sailed home with the signed document. What he found when he got back was not gratitude. It was rage. The Orthodox clergy of Constantinople denounced him. Monks who had stayed home while he was bargaining in Italy declared the union a betrayal. Crowds in the streets jeered the bishops who had signed. Ordinary people refused to take communion from priests who accepted the Florentine agreement. And somewhere in those months of fury, a phrase was spoken that the historian Ducas later attributed to a man named Lucas Notaras, the chief minister of the empire. The phrase, which modern scholars debate but cannot fully verify, has come down to us in a form that captures the temperature of that moment perfectly. Better the Sultan's turban in the city than the cardinal's hat. Think about what that line means. It is not the line of a man who hates Christianity. It is the line of a man who has decided that occupation by a Muslim sultan would be less of a violation than reunion with the Catholic Church. It is the language of a wound that had not healed in 8 generations. The Union of Florence was supposed to bring armies. The armies did not come. Or rather, the armies came too late and too few and in the wrong places. And by the time anyone in the Latin West was ready to honour the promises that John had bought with his church, the man he had bought them for was already dead. And the man who succeeded him, his brother Constantine, was running out of time. The final act of the Florentine agreement happened in Hagia Sophia on the 12th of December, 1452. The union was officially proclaimed inside the great church. A Latin Mass was celebrated on the same altar where, for centuries, only the Orthodox liturgy had been performed. The people of Constantinople boycotted the service. Many refused to enter the building at all. They said that Hagia Sophia had been defiled, that the union was an abomination, that the price John VIII had paid in Florence was too high. They said it 5.5 months before the Turks broke through the walls. The union the emperor had signed to save the city had divided the city instead, and the armies it was supposed to summon, the armies that were the whole point of signing it in the first place, were still being debated, still being delayed, still being argued about in chambers 1,000 miles away. There is a habit in the way we tell history that is hard to break even when you know you are doing it. We give our heroes interior lives, and we leave our villains as silhouettes. The men we admire get psychology and contradiction and growth. The men they fight get one trait, repeated, until the trait becomes the whole person. Constantine XI gets to be a complicated Christian emperor making impossible choices. Mehmed II gets to be a young fanatic with a cannon. It is a flattering way to tell the story. If you are on Constantine's side, it is also useless if you actually want to understand what happened in the spring of 1453. Mehmed II was 21 years old when he laid siege to Constantinople. Let that age sit with you for a moment, because most of us at 21 were not running anything more complicated than a part-time job. He had already been sultan once before, briefly, as a child, and then his own father had taken the throne back from him because the boy was not considered ready. He had grown up watching his father, Murad II, fight long and difficult wars against the Christian armies of Hungary and Poland, wars whose outcomes left lasting impressions on his son. He had lived in the long shadow of a competent father who openly doubted him. When Murad died in 1451, and Mehmed inherited the throne for the second time, the courts of Europe assumed they were dealing with a young man who would be easy to manage, a boy who would talk big and accomplish little, a sultan they could outweight. That assumption was the single most expensive mistake the Christian West made in the 15th century. Mehmed was not the fanatic that later Western propaganda would make him into, the historian Kritovolos, who served at his court and whose accounts must be read with care since he was writing to please the Sultan, credits him with knowledge of multiple languages beyond his native Turkish, including Greek, Arabic, and Persian. Modern historians like Franz Babinger have urged caution about how deeply Mehmed actually spoke these languages. But even the cautious reading leaves us with a young ruler who read widely, who studied the lives of Caesar and Alexander the Great, and who saw himself not as the man who would destroy Rome, but as the man who would inherit it. The Roman Empire, in his mind, had two seats. One of them had fallen to barbarians 1,000 years earlier. The other was still standing in Constantinople, and he intended to take possession of it the way a true heir takes possession of his father's house. This was a sultan who, before the siege even began, sent envoys to Constantine with a deal. Surrender the city. We will not sack it. You will keep your life. You will be given a province in the Peloponnese, the Morea, where you can rule as a vassal of mine. Your people will not be enslaved. Your churches will stand. Walk out with your dignity in your skin. And let me take possession of the inheritance that history has set aside for me. Constantine refused, but the existence of that offer matters. It does not fit the picture of the cruel zealot who came to slaughter Christians for the sake of religious conquest. It fits the picture of a young, ambitious, cold-blooded politician who would have preferred to take the city by negotiation, because cities taken by negotiation are easier to govern than cities taken by storm. The negotiation failed, so Mehmed reached for the other tool. There was a Hungarian engineer named Orban. The story of how Orban ended up casting cannons for the Ottoman Sultan tells you almost everything you need to know about why Constantinople fell. Orban was a craftsman who specialized in the new science of large bronze artillery, and he came first to Constantinople to offer his services to the Christian emperor. He knew where the threat was coming from. He knew which side had more to lose. He offered his work to Constantine first. Constantine could not afford him. This is one of the saddest sentences in the whole story. The man who could have built the guns that defended the walls offered his skills to the emperor. And the emperor of the Romans, sitting in the city that had once held the wealth of the Mediterranean, could not pay the going rate. The treasury was that empty. The Byzantine state in 1453 was so financially hollowed out that it could not retain the one engineer in the region who could have changed the outcome of the siege. So Orban walked across the Bosphorus and offered his services to Mehmed. According to Dokas, the Sultan paid him 4 times what Constantine had not been able to pay him at all. With that money, Orban cast what was very likely one of the largest guns ever made up to that point in history. The Ottomans called it the Basilica. It was over 27 feet long. It fired stone balls weighing several hundred pounds. It required dozens of oxen and hundreds of men to move it into position. Contemporary accounts agree that it could only be reloaded slowly, with long periods between each shot. But when it fired, it could crack the masonry that the land walls had relied on for centuries. The analysis that gets lost in most tellings is this: civilizations do not usually die because their enemies are stronger than they expected. They die because they cannot afford to pay for their own defence. Constantinople did not fall to Mehmed's brilliance alone. Though Mehmed was brilliant, it fell, in part, to a payroll problem. The bookkeeping of an empire that had lost its tax base could not retain the talent that the bookkeeping of a rising empire could easily afford. The cannon that broke the walls of Constantinople was built by a man who would have preferred to work for the other side. The tools to defend the city existed in the world. The empire could no longer afford to keep them. Mehmed understood the financial state of his enemy with the precision of a man who had studied his opponent's books. While the Christian West was debating in Rome and arguing in Venice and exhausting itself in Hungary, Mehmed was buying engineers. He was buying gunners. He was buying ships and timber and sailors and stonemasons. He was assembling the largest military operation the Eastern Mediterranean had seen in centuries. And he was paying for it with the wealth of an empire whose tax system actually worked. Then, in the year before the siege, he did something that no previous Ottoman sultan had quite dared to do. He built a fortress, not a small one, a massive stone castle on the European shore of the Bosphorus, at the narrowest point of the strait, where the water between Asia and Europe is barely half a mile wide. He called it Rumeli Hisari, the castle of the Romans. In mockery, it was finished in less than 5 months in the summer of 1452. From its towers, Ottoman gunners could fire on any ship attempting to pass north or south through the strait. The grain ships that fed Constantinople from the Black Sea, the trading vessels that brought Italian wine and Genoese cloth from the colonies of Crimea, all of them now had to pass under the guns of a fortress controlled by the Sultan. In a single summer, Mehmed had cut the city's throat without spilling a drop of blood. Constantinople could no longer be supplied from its northern sea route. The siege had begun, in the most literal logistical sense, almost a year before any soldier of his crossed the city walls. What did Christian Europe do about Rumeli Hisari? It sent letters. It convened councils. It issued diplomatic protests. The Pope wrote to the courts of Europe explaining that this was a violation of treaties. The Venetians sent ambassadors, the Genusa, who had a colony at Pera right across the harbour from Constantinople, protested through official channels and continued, quietly, to trade with the Ottomans. No army marched. No fleet sailed. Mehmed had drawn a line across the throat of the Christian East. And Christian Europe had answered him with paperwork. This was what was happening while the city behind the walls was waiting for sails. The historical lesson of Mehmed's first years on the throne is not really about his cruelty. It is about his clarity. He understood, with a precision that almost no one on the other side seems to have matched, exactly what the situation was. The Christian West was divided. The Byzantine treasury was empty. The Hungarian army was broken. The Venetians were calculating. The Pope was begging. And nobody in Latin Christendom had the will to act fast enough to matter. He looked at all of that, and he made a young man's decision. He decided to take the city now, before any of those facts changed. The Christians had been telling themselves for 2 centuries that someone, eventually, would unite Europe and lead a final crusade to save the East. Mehmed looked at the same evidence and saw something different. He saw that no one was coming, and he understood that if no one was coming, then the city was already his. He only had to walk up and collect it. To understand why Constantinople fell, you have to stop thinking of the West as a single thing. There was no West. There was no unified Christendom standing ready to defend its eastern flank. There were Italian republics with rival commercial interests. There was a papacy with moral authority and almost no military power. There was a Hungarian kingdom that had already bled itself white fighting Ottomans on its own border. There were French and English kings who had spent the last 100 years killing each other in the longest war Europe had yet produced. There were German princes loyal to no one but themselves. The word Christendom meant something on parchment. On the ground, it described a collection of states that could barely agree on the weather, let alone on the rescue of a city most of them had never seen. Start with Venice. The Venetians had more reason to care about Constantinople than almost anyone else in Latin Europe. They had a thriving merchant quarter inside the city. They had warehouses, residences, churches of their own right. They had Venetian families that had lived in the city for generations and considered it home. Niccolo Barbaro, the Venetian doctor whose diary we still read, was one of dozens of Venetians who would fight on the walls and either die there or barely escape with their lives. At the personal level, individual Venetians had genuine, deep, painful connections to the city. At the institutional level, the Republic of Venice operated on a different logic entirely. Venice was, before anything else, a commercial state. Its prosperity rested on long-distance trade between Europe and the East. Constantinople was a customer and a port. Cairo was another customer. The Ottoman Sultanate, sprawling now across Anatolia and the Balkans, was the largest emerging market in the region. Venice had a commercial treaty with the Ottomans. Venice had Venetian merchants in Ottoman ports. Venice had a commercial calculation that no amount of Christian sentiment could entirely override. In February of 1453, with the storm clouds visible to anyone who could read a map, the Venetian Senate met to debate whether to send a fleet to help Constantinople. The debate was real. Some senators argued passionately that Venice had a duty, both Christian and commercial, to defend the city. Others pointed out that the Republic's trade with the Ottomans was worth more than its trade with the dying Byzantine state. Others worried that a fleet sent to defend Constantinople might end up trapped if the city fell quickly. The Senate voted to send a fleet. The fleet did not leave in February. It did not leave in March. The captains were named. The ships were prepared. The supplies were gathered. But each step took longer than it should have. Funding had to be approved. Insurance arrangements had to be finalized. The commander, Giacomo Loredan, did not actually sail from Venice until late April. After the Ottoman siege had already begun on the 2nd of April, by the time his ships were creeping eastward across the Mediterranean, the cannons were already pounding the Theodosian Walls. By the time he reached the Aegean, Constantinople had already fallen. This is the part of the story that has no clear villain in it, which is exactly why it is so difficult to look at. No single Venetian decided to abandon Constantinople. No vote was taken to let the city die. The rescue was simply slowed by 1,000 small reasons. A senator who wanted more guarantees, a committee that needed to meet one more time, a treasurer who needed to verify the funding, a captain who needed additional instructions. Each delay was perfectly defensible. Each delay was perfectly responsible. And the cumulative effect of all of them, taken together, was that the fleet sailed too late to save a single life. Anyone who has watched a large institution try to respond to an emergency will recognize the pattern. A problem that everyone can see and nobody owns. A project that quietly fails because every person involved has a defensible reason for the small delay they personally contribute. The 15th century did not invent this kind of failure. It just provided one of the clearest examples of it. The Venetians were not heartless. They knew exactly what the right thing was, and they knew exactly what the cost of doing it on the right timeline would be. And they could not bring themselves to pay that cost in the weeks when it mattered. Now go across the harbour to Genoa. The Genoese situation was structurally similar to the Venetian one, but with an extra layer of confusion baked in. Genoa had its own merchant colony, the district of Pera. On the European side of the Golden Horn, just across the water from Constantinople itself. It was not technically inside the Byzantine city. It was Genoese territory, walled and self-governing, with its own podesta and its own laws, through the entire siege. Pera maintained an official policy of neutrality. Genoese merchants in Pera traded with Ottoman suppliers. Genoese ships passed under Ottoman guns with permits. The Genoese authorities in Pera explained to anyone who asked that they were not at war with the Sultan, and they hoped he would remember that fact when the siege was over. And yet, at the same time, individual Genoese citizens were dying on the walls of Constantinople for the city. The most famous of them was Giovanni Giustiniani Longo. He was a genius nobleman, a professional soldier with a reputation for competence in siege warfare. He arrived in Constantinople in January of 1453 with 700 troops he had recruited and paid for himself. 700 men is not an army. It is a strong battalion. But these were professional soldiers. properly equipped. And they came at the moment when the city most desperately needed exactly that kind of help. Constantine XI, with no other professional commanders to draw on, made an extraordinary decision. He placed Giustiniani in command of the defence of the land walls. The most critical sector of the most critical defence of the dying empire was given to a Genoese mercenary captain who had arrived 3 months earlier. Giustiniani fought like a man who had decided that this city was worth his life. He would be wounded in the final assault. He would leave the battlements. He would die not long afterward. On the journey home, or possibly at Chios, the question of whether his wound was severe enough to justify his withdrawal from the fighting is one that historians have argued about for 5 centuries. It is not a question that has a clean answer, but the moral complication you cannot escape is this: the Republic of Genoa, as an institution, was effectively neutral. The Genoese citizens of Pera traded with the Ottomans throughout the siege, and the Genoese commander on the walls was leading the most important sector of the defence, fighting and dying for the city that his own republic had officially refused to defend. This is what is meant by the failure of a network, not the failure of one bad actor, the failure of an entire interlocking system to do the thing it was supposed to do. Now turn north to Hungary. This is the piece of the story that almost every popular account of the fall of Constantinople leaves out. And leaving it out makes the whole story feel like a simple morality play. It is not. Hungary in 1453 was the one Christian power in Europe with proven military capability to fight the Ottomans on land. The kingdom had been the eastern shield of Latin Christendom for the better part of a century. Its regent, John Hunyadi, was a Hungarian warlord of genuine brilliance, the most experienced anti-Ottoman commander in Europe. Why did Hungary not come? Because Hungary had already come, and Hungary had already lost. In 1444, almost a decade before the siege of Constantinople, a Hungarian-Polish army under King Władysław III had marched against the Ottomans at the Battle of Varna, on the Black Sea coast of Bulgaria. The crusade ended in catastrophe. Władysław himself was killed in the fighting. The army was shattered. 4 years later, in 1448, John Hunyadi tried again at the Second Battle of Kosovo. He faced Murad II, the father of Mehmed, the same Murad who had trained the young sultan now camped outside Constantinople. Hunyadi lost. He barely escaped with his life. The Christian armies of the Danube frontier had been defeated twice in 5 years, and the second defeat had been particularly brutal. By 1453, Hungary was not in a position to march. The kingdom was exhausted. Its nobility was bickering over internal politics. Hunyadi himself was actually negotiating a truce with the Ottomans in the months when Constantinople was being besieged. Some Hungarian observers would have given everything to march east and break the siege. There simply was no Hungarian army left that could march. So when you ask where Christendom's army was, the answer turns out to be specific and historical and grim. It had already marched, and it had already died, on battlefields 9 and 5 years earlier than the one that mattered. The shield had been broken before the spear arrived, and while Venice debated and Hungary recovered, the kings of the further west were busy with their own affairs. The 100 Years' War between France and England was, by a coincidence of history that should make you stop and reread the sentence, ending in the very same year that Constantinople fell. The English would be expelled from their last continental holdings in 1453. The French monarchy would emerge from the war exhausted and broke. Neither court had the bandwidth or the money or the political will to send an army eastward. The Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick III, issued declarations but commanded almost nothing. The Burgundian Duke, Philip the Good, talked about a crusade for years and never actually sailed. This was the West that Mehmed II looked at across the Bosphorus, not a unified Christendom, a patchwork of exhausted states, each one with a perfectly good reason for not marching, none of them able to coordinate with the others, all of them counting on someone else to take the lead. The sentence that captures the entire situation, the one that is the heart of this video, is this: Constantinople did not die because the West hated it. It died because nobody in the West was finally responsible for it. A particular kind of death takes hold of institutions and cities and relationships when responsibility for them is distributed too thinly across too many actors. Nobody refuses outright. Nobody decides to do nothing. Each individual actor does what seems reasonable from their position. The Venetians delay. The Genoese hedge. The Hungarians are too tired. The French and English are killing each other. The Pope writes letters. And out of all those individually defensible decisions, a city dies. The 15th century did not invent distributed irresponsibility. It just gave us a city to remember it by. The siege itself lasted 53 days. From the 2nd of April to the 29th of May, 1453. We could walk through it day by day. Most accounts of the siege do exactly that. And most of those accounts blur together because the day-by-day rhythm of any siege is mostly tedium, punctuated by terror. And the tedium does not survive translation into a story. So let us walk through it instead through 5 moments. 5 turning points where you can see the shape of what was happening and feel the weight of what was being decided. The first moment is the ships across the hills. The Golden Horn is a narrow inlet of water that curves like a bent finger into the European shore of Constantinople. The harbour inside the Horn was the city's lifeline. Through it came supplies. Through it came reinforcements. Through it, in better centuries, had come the wealth of the world. The Byzantines knew that whoever controlled the Horn controlled the inner harbour, and so they had taken a precaution that had worked for centuries. They had stretched a massive iron chain across the mouth of the Horn, supported by floats, anchored at both ends, capable of stopping any Ottoman ship that tried to sail in. The chain held. Throughout April, Mehmed's fleet tried to force it and failed. As long as the chain held, the inner harbour was safe. The city could be supplied along the northern wall, and the defenders could concentrate their attention on the land walls to the west. Mehmed solved this problem in a way that no one on the Christian side seems to have anticipated. He went around it. On the night of the 22nd of April, his engineers laid greased wooden rollers along a path that climbed up over the hills behind the Genoese district of Pera, and then descended back down to the Golden Horn on the other side of the chain. Then his sailors hauled a fleet of ships, by hand, up over the hills and down into the water on the inside of the chain. Contemporary accounts give numbers ranging from around 60 to over 70 vessels. The exact figure is uncertain, but the effect is not. By morning, an Ottoman fleet was floating inside the Horn, behind the defensive boom that the Byzantines had been counting on for centuries. The strategic effect was real. The defenders now had to spread their men along the harbour wall as well as the land walls. The city had to be defended on 2 fronts instead of 1. But the psychological effect was larger. Mehmed had taken what was supposed to be impossible and made it ordinary. He had announced, in the most visible way he could manage, that he was prepared to invent solutions the defenders had not even thought to prepare for. After the ships came over the hills, every Byzantine commander on the walls had to wonder what else this young sultan was capable of imagining. The second moment is 4 ships. On the 20th of April, in the early afternoon, the people of Constantinople watching from the sea walls saw something they had stopped believing they would ever see. 4 large Christian ships were sailing up the coast toward the city. 3 of them were Genoese, hired by the Pope and loaded with grain and weapons for the defenders. 1 was Byzantine, carrying additional supplies. They had set out from the south weeks earlier, and now they were trying to reach the chain at the mouth of the Golden Horn. Mehmed saw them too. He ordered the entire Ottoman fleet to intercept them. What followed was one of the strangest naval engagements in medieval history. 4 tall, heavily built Christian sailing ships fought off the Ottoman fleet for hours. The Christian ships had the advantage of height. Their archers and crossbowmen could fire down onto the lower Turkish galleys. Their hulls were thick enough to resist ramming. The wind was with them when they needed it. And when the wind dropped and the Ottoman oared, galleys began to swarm them. The Christians lashed their 4 ships together into a single floating fortress and continued to fight off boarders. By evening, all 4 ships had broken through to the chain, which the defenders lowered to let them pass into the safety of the inner harbour. Niccolo Barbaro records what happened next in Mehmed's camp. The Sultan, watching from horseback at the shoreline, was so enraged by the failure of his fleet that he reportedly rode his horse into the surf. Screaming at his commanders, the admiral was beaten in front of the assembled officers and stripped of his command. He survived, but barely. That single engagement matters more than its tactical results suggest. 4 ships had broken through the largest naval blockade the eastern Mediterranean had seen in generations. The arithmetic is brutal and clarifying. If 4 ships could do that, what could a Venetian fleet of 50 have done? What could a coordinated Latin relief force have achieved if it had arrived in March instead of June? The defenders on the walls saw those 4 ships sail through and they understood, with absolute clarity, that the city was savable. The materials existed. The will did not. The third moment is the night of the 28th of May. It is the night before the final assault. Mehmed has spent the previous days preparing his army for a coordinated attack. The bombardment has been intensifying. Sections of the land walls have been broken by the basilica and its smaller cannons. And although the defenders have managed to repair the breaches with timber and dirt and barrels, the wall is no longer a wall in any continuous sense. It is a sequence of patches and improvisations. Every defender on the line knows this. Constantine XI does not sleep that night. He walks the walls. He visits the defenders, Greek and Italian, Catholic and Orthodox, professional and volunteer. He gives a speech that 2 of the eyewitness chroniclers, Francis and Leonard of Chios, later try to reconstruct. The exact words are not certain, but the sense of what he said is well attested. He told them that they were defending their faith, their homes, their families, and the heritage of 1,000 years of Roman Christianity. According to Leonard of Chios, he reminded the Italians that this was now their city too, that the cause they fought for was no longer Greek alone but Christian. He said he himself would not survive the city. Then, late in the evening, something happened that had not happened in Constantinople for over a year. A service was held inside Hagia Sophia, and for the first time since the proclamation of the Union the previous December, Catholic and Orthodox Christians attended together. They prayed together. They received communion side by side. Citizens who had refused to enter the great church for months walked in that night and knelt with the Italians and the Catholics and prayed for the city. The reunion that John VIII had tried to buy in Florence, the reunion that the people had refused for 14 years, finally happened in the last hours before the assault. It happened because it no longer cost anything to happen. There was nothing left to preserve by staying divided. The 4th moment is the collapse. In the hours before dawn on the 29th of May, the final assault began. The Ottomans attacked in 3 waves. First, irregular troops, lightly armed and lightly armoured, sent forward to wear down the defenders and use up their ammunition. Then the regular Anatolian infantry. Finally, the Janissaries, the Sultan's elite professional household troops, the best soldiers in Mehmed's army. The defenders held. Wave after wave broke against the walls and was thrown back. By the time the 3rd wave came in, Giustiniani's men were exhausted, but the breach in the wall was still being defended. The siege, against all probability, was not yet lost. 2 things happened in close succession that ended it. The first comes to us mainly through the chronicler Ducas, and his account is not fully corroborated by the other contemporary writers. Byzantine, Latin, or Ottoman. According to Ducas, there was a small gate in the city walls called the Kirko Porta. In the chaos of the night, the gate may have been left unbarred or unguarded. A small group of Ottoman soldiers found it, slipped through, climbed up onto the inner wall, and raised an Ottoman flag from the battlements. If the story is true, and the modern scholarly position is that we cannot fully confirm it, then it is the perfect symbol of how the city actually fell. Not because the great walls were finally breached, not because the basilica had done its work, because somewhere in 12 miles of fortification, after 8,000 defenders had stood at their posts for 53 days, without enough sleep and without enough food and without enough men. A single small door had not been properly secured. A system that had run out of attention had failed at the smallest possible point. In the same minutes that the rumour of the Kirk Porta was beginning to spread, Giovanni Giustiniani Longo was hit. The accounts differ on exactly how. He may have been struck by a crossbow bolt, by an arrow, by shrapnel from one of the smaller Ottoman cannons. The wound was severe enough that he could no longer command. He asked to be taken off the wall. This is the moment that historians have argued about for centuries. Was the wound severe enough to justify withdrawal? Or did Giustiniani break? We cannot know. What we do know is the effect. When the defenders saw their commander being carried away from the breach, the line began to waver. The Italians who had been fighting under him began to follow him toward the harbour. Within minutes, the breach that they had defended through wave after wave of Ottoman assault was no longer being held. He was taken by ship out of the city. He died, depending on the source, either on the voyage or shortly after reaching Chios. There is no clean ending to his story. He saved the city for as long as it could be saved. And then, possibly, he could not bear to die for it. Or possibly the wound did exactly what wounds do, and he had no choice. Both readings are possible. Neither one resolves into the kind of clean heroism or clean failure that history likes to remember. The fifth moment is Constantine XI, when word spread along the walls that the Ottomans were inside the city, that the breach had fallen, that the commander of the defence had been carried away. The emperor was at the inner wall near the St. Romanus Gate. The eyewitness accounts of what he did next vary in detail, but they agree on the substance. He took off the imperial insignia that marked him as the emperor, the purple cloak, the crown, the distinctive boots. He set them aside, drew his sword, and walked into the press of fighting like an ordinary soldier. His body was never identified with certainty. Mehmed, after the city fell, ordered a search for it. Bodies were brought to him that might have been the emperor. None of them could be confirmed. The line of Roman emperors that had run for nearly 15 centuries ended with a man who walked into the crowd and was never seen again as himself. A Greek legend grew up later. The Marble Emperor, the idea that an angel had taken Constantine XI at the last moment and turned him to stone, and that one day, when the time was right, the angel would return and wake him, and the emperor would lead the people of the city back to take it from the Turks. That is not history. That is something else. We will come back to it at the end. By mid-morning on the 29th of May, 1453, the city was inside Ottoman hands. The siege was over. What came next was 3 days of something else. The historical record of the next 3 days is grim, and I will be direct about what it contains without lingering on details that exist only to disturb. Under the customs of medieval warfare and the legal framework that the Ottoman administration invoked, a city that refused an offer of surrender could be given over to the soldiers for a limited period. Mehmed allowed this. By the conventions of the time, on both sides of the Mediterranean, on both sides of the Christian-Muslim divide, the rules were broadly the same. Cities that surrendered were spared. Cities that resisted were not. Constantinople had refused Mehmed's offer of terms before the siege. The consequences of that refusal were now applied. For 3 days, the city was handed over. The numbers we have for what happened in those 3 days come mostly from contemporary chroniclers and later sources. And like all such numbers from pre-modern sieges, they should be treated with appropriate caution. Stephen Runciman, drawing on those sources, estimated that roughly 30,000 of the city's inhabitants were taken as slaves. Other modern historians have offered different figures. What is consistent across the accounts is that the population of 50,000 was, in the course of 3 days, broken apart. Many were killed in the fighting that continued after the main defence collapsed, in fires, in the chaos of crowds trying to escape through streets that had become traps. Some escaped on Italian ships that managed to break out through the harbour in the morning hours. Some were eventually ransomed by relatives or by foreign embassies. Some simply vanished into the larger story of the Ottoman world and were never accounted for again. Hold on to the scale of what 50,000 people means. It is not an abstract figure. It is roughly the population of a small American city today. Imagine your hometown. If you live in a place of that size, imagine every neighbourhood, every shop, Every church and school and family on every street. All of it. On a single morning, given over to 3 days of catastrophe. That is what happened to Constantinople. The arithmetic of it is what makes it real. On the third day, Mehmed entered the city personally. He rode through gates that his troops had taken by force, through streets that were still smoking, past buildings that had stood for 1,000 years and would stand for many centuries more. He had been outside the walls for 53 days. He was now finally inside the city that he had dreamed about and read about and planned for since he was a boy. He was 21 years old. His destination was Hagia Sophia. The great church had stood for over 900 years. It was, at the time it was built, the largest enclosed space in the Christian world. The architectural masterpiece of the Byzantine state. The building in which emperors had been crowned and patriarchs consecrated since the age of Justinian. Mehmed had seen drawings of it. He had heard descriptions. He had probably never been inside. What happened when he arrived is described differently in different sources. The accounts agree on the substance. Mehmed entered the building. He stopped the looting that had been taking place inside. He gave orders that the structure was to be preserved, not destroyed, and that it was to be converted from a Christian church into a Muslim mosque. According to Critouvulos, the Greek historian who would later serve at his court and whose account must be read with the awareness that he was writing for the Sultan, Mehmed picked up a handful of dust from the floor and sprinkled it on his own head. The gesture was a traditional one in the Islamic world, a gesture of humility before God in the face of worldly triumph. There is a detail in this scene that deserves attention. The Hagia Sophia Mehmed walked into was the same building where, 5 months earlier, the Union of Florence had been formally proclaimed and the people of the city had boycotted the service. The same altar on which a Latin Mass had been celebrated in December. The altar that many citizens believed had been defiled by Catholic ritual was now being repurposed for Muslim prayer. The bitter Orthodox prophecy that better the Sultan's turban than the cardinal's hat had, in the most literal way possible, come true. The Latin clergy had vanished from the scene. The Sultan was here. The building had survived. And the building had changed. What Mehmed did next is the part of the story that popular accounts tend to leave out. And it changes the shape of the man at the centre of it. He looked for the leader of the Orthodox Church. The Patriarchate had been effectively vacant. The previous patriarch had fled to Italy years earlier in protest against the anti-Union faction. The Orthodox Church inside the city had been operating without a recognised head. Mehmed wanted that fixed. He found his patriarch in a monk named Gennadios Scholarios. Gennadios was a serious scholar and one of the most articulate opponents of the Union of Florence. He had argued against it before, during, and after John VIII had signed it. He was the leader of the faction inside the Orthodox Church that had said for 14 years that they would rather live under Muslim rule than accept Roman supremacy. Mehmed found him, brought him to the city, and made him Patriarch of Constantinople. It would be easy to read this as a generous gesture, as the Sultan honouring Christian sensibilities, as a sign of religious tolerance. That reading is not entirely wrong, but it misses the political genius of what was actually happening. Mehmed was doing two things at once. He was creating a Christian institution that owed its existence directly to him, and he was permanently severing the link between the Orthodox Church and Western Christendom that the Union of Florence had tried to forge. From this point onward, the Patriarch of Constantinople would serve under Ottoman authority. The Orthodox population of the empire would be administered through their own church, but that church would answer to the Sultan. This arrangement was the seed of what later historians would sometimes call the millet system. The term is anachronistic if applied too directly to 1453. The fully developed institutional structure that scholars label millet emerged over centuries. But the principle Mehmed established in the weeks after the conquest was the foundation that everything later would build upon. Mehmed acted on something that many Latin powers had failed to handle effectively in their own dealings with religious minorities. A conquered religious community does not always need to be destroyed. It can be governed through its own leadership, provided that leadership owes its position to you. And then there is Lucas Notaras, the man who, according to Docus, had said better the Sultan's turban than the cardinal's hat. was alive when Mehmed entered the city. The historical record on what happened to him is reasonably clear. After the city fell, Notaras was initially treated with apparent honour by the new regime. Within roughly 2 weeks, something changed. The sources differ on the exact reason. Some accounts suggest that Mehmed came to believe Notaras was untrustworthy, that there were rumours of conspiracies, that the political logic of taking a recently subdued city required the elimination of its most prominent civilian leader. Notaras and several of his sons were executed. If the line attributed to him by Ducas is genuine, then his end carries a particular weight. He had said he would rather have the turban than the hat. He got the turban. The turban killed him. One more thing about those 3 days, said carefully because it matters. What happened to Constantinople was not unique to the Ottoman conquest. The Fourth Crusade, in 1204, when Latin Christian soldiers sacked the same city, was by every contemporary account no less brutal. The conduct of armies of every faith in the medieval Mediterranean, when they took a resisting city, fell within a similar range. This is not a story about the unique cruelty of any particular religious tradition. It is a story about what 15th century warfare did when its rules were followed and a city had refused its terms. What was unique about Constantinople was not the violence of the 3 days. What was unique was the cultural weight of what was being destroyed. Whatever fraction of the city's books, its icon, its libraries, its accumulated material memory survived those 3 days. An enormous fraction did not. One of the largest living reservoirs of Greek and Roman classical knowledge in continuous existence since antiquity was scattered, burned, looted, or carried away in those 72 hours. Some of it would resurface in Italy, in private collections, in monastery libraries. Some of it would not. When the looting officially ended on the 3rd day, the city that had been the second Rome was no longer that city. It was something new now. It was the new capital of a Muslim empire that would last another 4.5 centuries. The news travelled the way news travelled in the 15th century, which is to say slowly and by water and through people who often had reasons to shade what they were reporting. It moved on Italian merchant ships, then on overland courier routes, then through diplomatic channels in the courts that received it. A few details would arrive ahead of the full account. Then more would follow. Then, weeks later, the survivors themselves would begin to arrive in Italian ports, carrying their stories and their wounds. It reached Venice on the 29th of June, a full month after the city had fallen. The first reports came from Venetian galleys that had escaped from the harbour in the chaos of the morning. The Venetian State Archives still preserve the responses of the Senate. The first reaction recorded in the official minutes is one of urgent commercial concern. The Venetian quarter inside Constantinople had been destroyed. Venetian merchants had been killed. The trading routes through the eastern Mediterranean were now controlled by a sultan who had just demonstrated, on a spectacular scale, that he was willing and able to seize cities that his treaties had supposedly protected. The institutional response of the Republic was about damage control and continuity of commerce. The diary of Niccolo Barbaro, who had been a doctor on a Venetian ship trapped inside the harbour during the siege, survives precisely because Venetian individuals carried it home and preserved it. Barbaro's account is full of personal grief, full of admiration for the defenders, full of bitterness at what had been lost. He is not an institutional voice. He is a man who watched the city die and felt it. There were Venetians on those walls who fought and died for Constantinople alongside Greeks and Genoese. The distinction that matters here is the one between a republic deliberating in marble chambers and the people who carried the actual human cost of its delays. The Senate of Venice and the city of Venice were not the same thing in the summer of 1453. They rarely are. In any century, Pope Nicholas V received the news a few weeks later. Contemporary sources report that he wept openly when he heard. He called immediately for a new crusade. He drafted letters to every Christian sovereign in Europe. He used what authority he had, which by the political logic of the 15th century was less than the popes of 2 centuries earlier had wielded, but still considerable, to summon a coordinated military response. The crusade did not happen. The reasons it did not happen are exactly the reasons that the relief of Constantinople itself had not happened in time. France and England were ending the 100 Years' War and rebuilding shattered economies. The German princes were quarrelling among themselves. The Italian states had their own commercial calculations to make with the Ottomans, who were now their direct neighbours and major trading partners. Hungary was still recovering from the defeats at Varna and Kosovo. The crusade became, like so many 15th century crusades, a project that was always being planned and never being launched. Nicholas V died 2 years later. Some later accounts attribute his death to grief over what he had failed to prevent. We should be honest about the limits of what 15th century medicine could tell us about any pope's actual cause of death. What we can say is that the man who had watched it happen, who had begged the courts of Europe to act, who had cried in his chambers when the messengers arrived, did not live long enough to organise the response he had wanted. He carried it with him until he died. The most haunting Western response to the fall came from a senior cleric and diplomat named Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, a humanist scholar who would later become Pope Pius II. When the news reached him, he wrote a famous letter to Pope Nicholas V that survives in his collected correspondence. The substance of what he wrote, paraphrased from the dense Latin original, ran something like this: "We have lost our libraries. We have lost the inheritance of the ancients, the works of Homer and Plato and the philosophers, the books that were preserved nowhere else, the knowledge that the Greeks had carried for 2,000 years. All of this has been destroyed or scattered. This is not a political loss. This is the death of a cultural body that the West had lived from for centuries without quite realizing how much it was living from." He went further. In the famous image that has come down to us as paraphrase rather than direct quotation, Piccolomini suggested that Homer himself had now died a second time. After the first death he had suffered when ancient civilization fell, the letter is famous because it captures, in a single short text, the realization that was beginning to dawn in the Latin West. They had not just lost a city, they had not just lost a Christian ally, they had lost something they had not even known they possessed. For centuries, Constantinople had been the storehouse of classical learning. The Byzantines had preserved the texts of Greek antiquity, copying them by hand from generation to generation, while the Latin West had lost direct access to many of those Greek texts during the long centuries of medieval upheaval. By 1453, Italian humanists like Piccolomini had been quietly hungry for Greek manuscripts for over 100 years. Byzantine scholars who came to Italy in the decades before the fall had been treated as treasures by Italian princes precisely because of the books and the linguistic knowledge they carried. Now those scholars came in larger numbers, and they came as refugees. Cardinal Bessarion, a Greek scholar who had supported the Union of Florence and remained in Italy after the council, eventually being elevated to cardinal, became one of the most important figures in the preservation of what survived. He spent his remaining decades collecting Greek manuscripts from refugees, from monasteries, from estate sales, building a library that he donated to the Republic of Venice. That library became part of the foundation of the Bibliotheca Marciana, which still exists today. The part of the story that complicates everything else is what came next. The older textbooks used to say that the fall of Constantinople caused the Renaissance, that the flood of Greek scholars and texts into Italy in 1453 sparked the cultural revival of the following century. Modern historians have moved away from that simple causation. The Italian Renaissance had begun a century before Constantinople fell. The flow of Greek learning into Italy had been continuous and significant since at least 1400. The fall of 1453 did not start something. It accelerated something that was already in motion, but the acceleration was real. The manuscripts that survived, the scholars who escaped, the institutional energy that the catastrophe injected into the recovery of Greek learning. All of this did flow westward in the years after the fall, which leaves a question that has always sat uneasily underneath this part of the story. Did the West benefit, in the long run, from a death that it had failed to prevent? The Latin West did not engineer the fall of Constantinople. The Latin West did not want it to happen. Nicholas V was sincere in his tears. As yet, the intellectual capital of 1,000 years of Byzantine scholarship was scattered westward in the years after the fall. Italian collectors bought manuscripts that refugees brought with them in their luggage. Italian universities hired professors who would have been teaching in Constantinople if the city had survived. Some of that absorption would have happened anyway. Some of it, almost certainly, happened only because Constantinople had died. The honest answer is that the Latin West, in the centuries after 1453, did not spend much time asking that question. The manuscripts were absorbed, the scholars were hired, the Renaissance proceeded. The fall of Constantinople became, in the Western memory, a historical event rather than a moral indictment. It was something that had happened, far away, to people who had refused the Union and brought it upon themselves. The people who saw it more clearly were not in the West at all. They were in the Greek diaspora that scattered across Italy and the Aegean, and eventually Russia, carrying the memory of what had been lost and the awareness that the people who had survived alone. Some of them wrote, some of them taught, some of them, generations later, still kept the old date, the 29th of May, as a day of mourning. In the Orthodox world it is still considered an unlucky day. Tuesday, the day the city fell, is still avoided for weddings and important undertakings in some Greek communities. The memory does not run out. The memory only goes underground. By the end of the summer of 1453, the news had reached every major court in Europe. The shock had passed. The crusade had not been organised. Trade with the Ottomans was being renegotiated. The refugees were being received, often grudgingly, often with charity, often with the polite indifference that surviving institutions extend to people whose institutions have just collapsed. The political problem of Mehmed II was now everyone's problem. And the political problem of the dead city was nobody's anymore. The world had moved on. That is what worlds do. Most of what gets said about the fall of Constantinople in modern history textbooks fits inside a single sentence. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 marks the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the modern era. That sentence has appeared in some form in nearly every survey of European history written in the last 2 centuries. It has the advantage of being simple, easy to remember, and useful for organising a syllabus. It has the disadvantage of being mostly meaningless. The transition from medieval to modern Europe was not an event. It was a process that ran for at least 2 centuries, in different ways and at different speeds in different regions. Choosing 1453 as the dividing line between 2 eras is a teaching convenience, not a historical insight. It puts a tidy fence around a messy and continuous transformation. So the real importance of 1453 is not where you put it on a timeline. It is in what it shows you about how things actually die. Cities, institution, nation, communities of every kind. All of them eventually face the question that Constantinople faced. They become dependent on something outside themselves to keep going. Resources from elsewhere, promises from allies, faith in a rescue that is coming. And for a long time, that dependence can look perfectly fine. The walls are standing, the flags are flying, the institutions are functioning. From a distance, everything looks intact. What is happening underneath that surface, in the cases that end the way Constantinople ended, is a slow accumulation of small failures by other people. A senator deciding that this month is not the right month to authorise the funds. A duke putting off the conversation until after the harvest. A king realising he cannot afford another campaign after his last 2 armies were destroyed. A pope writing letters that nobody answers. None of these decisions is dramatic. None of them is wicked. Each of them is, in its immediate context, perfectly reasonable. And the cumulative effect of all of them is that a city of 50,000 people dies on a Tuesday morning, while the rescue that everyone agreed was important is still being scheduled. This is the lesson the fall of Constantinople offers, and it is 1-0 in the way we usually tell history quite prepares us for. The death of a civilization is not, usually, a moment. It is an accumulation. The moment, when it comes, is just the date that gets written down. Consider the comparison with Thermopylae. We remember the 300 Spartans, the narrow pass, the defiant last stand. We remember it because it is clean. The Spartans died at the right moment, before anything got complicated. before they had to walk down off the hill and figure out what to do with the rest of their lives. Their heroism is preserved because they did not survive it. Their sacrifice has the perfection of something that ended at exactly the moment it should have ended. We do not remember Constantinople in the same way. We do not remember it because its story is messy. No single hero. No clean villain. No moment when a brave man chose death over surrender in a way that resolved the moral situation. Instead, Constantine XI, who died well, but also rejected terms that would have saved 50,000 civilians. Giustiniani, who fought brilliantly and then either could not or would not stay at his post in the final moments. The Venetian Senate, which voted to help and then delayed until help was useless. Mehmed, who was 21 and ruthless and brilliant, and not the cartoon villain that Western chronicles needed him to be. The Latin West, which loved Constantinople in the abstract and could not bring itself to pay for it in the concrete. No single story about Constantinople lets you feel uncomplicated about it afterward. No monument can be built to it that does not have to acknowledge that everyone involved, on every side, was acting on reasons that made sense to them at the time. That is why we do not remember it the way we remember Thermopylae. The Thermopylae story is one civilizations tell themselves to feel proud. The Constantinople story is one civilizations tell themselves to feel uneasy. We prefer pride to unease. Most cultures do, but the Greek memory of the fall has done something with the event that the Western memory has not. Constantine XI's body was never identified. Mehmed sent searchers to find it after the fall, and they brought back several possibilities, none of which could be confirmed. The Emperor of the Romans simply disappeared into the press of the fighting and was never seen again as himself. The Greek folk imagination did not accept that ending. A tradition grew up, over the centuries that followed, that an angel had come to Constantine in the last moments. The angel had carried him from the battlefield and turned him into marble. He had been hidden somewhere beneath the city, or beneath the Golden Gate that Ottoman armies had blocked up because the Byzantine prophecies said a Christian emperor would one day re-enter the city through it. There he sleeps, the marble emperor, the king who is not dead, only waiting. And one day, when the time is right, the angel will return and wake him, and he will rise, and he will lead his people back to take the city. There is no marble emperor sleeping beneath Constantinople, but the legend does something the historical record cannot. It is how a community holds on to what it cannot get back. The Greeks who lost their capital, whose great church became a mosque, whose patriarchate now answered to a Muslim sultan, whose state had simply stopped existing, needed a way to live with that loss without surrendering to it completely. They could not have the city back. They could not bring the emperor back. What they could do was tell a story that kept both of them alive in a different form. Not dead, only sleeping. Not lost, only waiting. The story gave them a future that the historical situation had taken away. Something honourable lives in that, and something that historical analysis alone has trouble fully capturing. The legend of the marble emperor is not a delusion. It is the survival, in another form, of something that the Ottoman conquest could not actually destroy. Stories can outlive states. Memories can outlive empires. A community displaced from its capital can carry its capital with it for centuries, in songs and legends and rituals, and the persistent refusal to forget. The Greek diaspora has been doing exactly that for over 500 years now. The marble emperor is part of how they have done it. This is something else the simple chronological framing of 1453 misses. The city fell, but the community that lived in the city did not fall with it. The community scattered, and the community remembered, and the community kept the memory alive long enough that we are still talking about the city today. A kind of survival exists that empires do not measure. The marble emperor sleeps in a place no Ottoman governor could find. The fall of Constantinople was a loss that could not be reversed. The city did not return to the Greeks. The Ottoman conquest stood. The empire was finished, and no amount of marble emperor folklore could change that fact. But the Greek response to that finality was not surrender. It was something more complicated. They accepted what had to be accepted, and they refused to accept what did not have to be accepted. and they kept the line between those two things alive for centuries. The state was gone. The faith continued. The capital was lost. The memory of the capital was preserved. The emperor was dead. The promise of the emperor was kept. That is the inheritance of Constantinople. It does not come with a clean lesson. It comes with a set of questions. What did we owe each other? What did we fail to pay? What can be preserved when the thing itself cannot be saved? Who finally was responsible? And who finally was not? These are not questions any single video can answer. They are questions the fall of the city asked, and that the survivors carried away with them, and that anyone who has ever loved an institution, or a community, or a place that was eventually lost is still, somewhere, carrying as well. Return to the wall. The men on the Theodosian Walls. The night of the 28th of May, 1453. They had been there for hours, and they would be there until the morning. And the morning was the one not all of them would walk away from. The horizon was empty. The sea was still bringing no ships. We can imagine what they were watching for, because we know what their city had been told. A fleet that Venice had voted to send. A crusade that Rome had called for. An army that Hungary might once have raised. The promises were not entirely lies. They were only late. And late was its own kind of lie by the spring of 1453. The story is not really about those men. The story is about every person, in every court and chamber and city, who could have helped and did not, or who tried to help and ran out of time. It is about the senator in Venice who voted yes on the rescue fleet and then went home for dinner and could not have told you, in his own mind, exactly when the right week for the fleet to sail would have been. It is about the Pope in Rome, writing letters in the small hours, trying to summon a Christian Europe that had stopped meaningfully existing. It is about the Hungarian general signing a truce, because his country had bled out for the cause already and had nothing more to give. It is about the French king and the English king finishing their 100-year quarrel in the same month that Constantinople was being bombarded. Two distant wars that had nothing to do with each other except that one of them used up all the resources that might have saved the other. None of these people were evil. That is what makes the story so difficult to tell honestly. They were busy. They were far away. They were tired. They were broke. They were occupied with problems that mattered enormously to them, and that had nothing to do with the walls of a Greek city 1,000 miles east of where they were standing. They had wives and children and harvests and accounts. They had their own dying cities, smaller ones, that they were trying to keep alive. The world that did not save Constantinople was a world full of people doing their best with what was directly in front of them. A city does not have to be hated in order to die. It only has to be left alone long enough by enough people who all had reasonable reasons to be looking somewhere else. That is the harder version of the story. The version that does not give us a simple villain to point at and feel better. The version that asks something more difficult of us. Somewhere in the networks each of us belongs to, in the institutions we depend on, in the communities that depend on us. There are quieter versions of the same pattern. A project waiting for one more advocate. A relationship waiting for one more visit. An institution waiting for one more person to do the work that nobody is being paid to do. The Constantinople pattern is rarely about an empire. It is usually about something much closer to where we are standing. The question the city asks is not how empires fall. We have the answer to that one. The cannons broke the walls. The treasury was empty. The fleet sailed too late. We know the mechanism now. And we have known it for 5.5 centuries. The harder question is the one already being asked in the silence over the Bosphorus. On the last night anyone would ever stand watch as a citizen of the Second Rome. Will we see it? In whatever form it takes for us. Before the morning comes,